Hello, and welcome to Naphammer. Today we're going to be discussing one way to plan out a narrative campaign for Age of Sigmar, or what I like to call the narrative pizza method. So one of the things I'm really passionate about is I enjoy making narrative campaigns for people to play in, for people to participate in, and for people to create stories off of. And I wanted to use this series to share my insight with the lessons that I have learned creating narrative campaigns for a store setting that hopefully you'll be able to apply either for building your local community if you have a store that you go to, or for your friends to be able to play and to be able to have these great interacting methods of narrative and interacting stories that make sense but aren't so aren't so time draining and a big commitment on your part. And one of the methods that I have come up that I always use whenever I make a narrative campaign is called my narrative pizza. And I'm going to walk you through the 3 steps of a narrative pizza and how those will help you in creating your own narrative campaign. I find that when I am writing a narrative campaign, the very first thing that I want to do is I want to determine how large, in terms of players, my narrative campaign is going to serve. Will it be an individual campaign that only you are playing through, or will it be one for a store to run through? When I am determining the size of my narrative campaigns, I like to think in terms of making a pizza. Say you have to make a pizza with a cup of pizza sauce, a cup of cheese, and a cup of pepperoni. Who you are intending to feed is directly correlated to the size of your pizza and how to use the set resources to make that pizza. If it's only a personal pizza, all of your ingredients can be concentrated for one person. If it's a large pizza, all of your ingredients have to be spread out, so that way each person gets a taste of the ingredient, but it's still a pizza as a whole. In this case, the size of your pizza represents how many players you are expecting to play in your campaign. I tend to break down my expectations for narrative campaigns as follows. As you can see here, I've broken down my pizza size or my narrative campaign size into 4 main sections: the personal, the small, the medium, and the large. When I think about how large these narrative campaigns run, I tend to break it down as following. If it's a personal narrative campaign or a personal pizza, it's usually going to be serving just one person, you. Personal, you. If it's a small one, I would say you could expect that to be 2 to 6 players, either including yourself or yourself as the GM. A medium narrative campaign would be about 7 to 10 players, and a large narrative campaign would be about 10 or more players. Once you've broken down your narrative campaign into who you expect to serve, then you can start thinking about where you want to invest your time. Once you've determined the size of your pizza or campaign, the next step is arguably the most important step, which is what ingredients are going onto your pizza. Or in our case, what topics are you going to be focusing on in your campaign? There are 4 main topics that I like to focus on when I'm writing a narrative campaign. Those topics break down into rules, story arc, player choice, and scenario. Let's break down what each of those means. This is where you make the decision of special rules that you're going to be writing in your campaign. Are you going to use a brand new rule set for your players to use, or are you going to go straight by the book, or somewhere in between? If you choose the former, then you'll have to invest more time in thinking about the rules that you are writing. You'll want to make sure that those rules are fair and don't favor one player over another. If you are choosing to go this route, it's often a good idea to talk with other people in your campaign about the rules that you make. That way, you have a sounding board about what you're creating and don't have to go it alone. Also, Keep in mind that you are asking your players to take time to read the new rules that you have created. Expect about half to not have read it in my experience. If you are choosing to go with the rules as written, then you don't have to spend a lot of time figuring out the rules. If it's somewhere in the middle, then you might change rules like point values of units, or units being able to take more than one artifact, etc. When you are thinking about your story arc, be thinking about how detailed you want it to be. Are you just having games that are being played that are linked but don't affect the next game? Or are the games that you are playing directly affecting the next one in the series? Do your players know what the end goal of the campaign is? Or are they only shown the next step once they have finished the previous step? The latter takes a lot more forethought, because you, as the GM, need to know what possible outcomes there are beforehand. Say you're playing a game between player A and player B. You'll want to know where the story goes if player A wins, but you're also going to want to think about how that story will differ if player B wins. And if they tie, how does that affect the overall story? Compare that to the time commitment if you wanted players to know the end goal. Say an army is preparing to lay siege to a castle. Then players know at the end of this campaign a siege will occur, regardless of if I win all of my games or if I lose all of my games. That will save you some time and hopefully prevent burnout when you are writing a campaign, but your players already know what's going to happen. So there's pluses and minuses to both styles of creating a narrative campaign. How much autonomy do you want your players to have? Do you want your players railroaded to a story where how they do in each game either gives them a benefit or a detriment in the final game? Or do you want them to be able to do whatever comes to mind as they play? Whatever your choice is, a good rule of thumb is if you don't want something to happen, don't give the players the choice of allowing it to happen. If you need them to take a mystical object from a temple, don't ask them if they want to go to the temple, because there's a chance they'll say no and throw off your story. For example, I had a friend who was running a campaign when the Ossiarch Bone Reapers came out. His original intention was to have our small bands fight off the Bone Reapers together, and they would be the big bad of the campaign. However, in the very first game, he had the Bone Reapers give us a choice to dedicate a tithe to them in exchange for an artifact of power. He expected us to refuse the deal, but three of us decided to take the deal. Luckily, it worked out well because there were 6 players, so it was clearly setting up a 3v3 team battle that could still work mechanically and narratively. What he could have done instead, to make sure that it was us against the Bone Reapers, is instead of having them show up and ask people to join the tithe, he could have had them show up and say they were here to collect their tithe of bones. Then it establishes the fact that they are the enemy, and sometime in our army's past or our faction's past, we declared that we would pay something and renege on it. Finally, the last topic that I consider is the scenario. Will I make a custom scenario for each player, or will I pull from the book? Will they be determined beforehand, or will they randomly be determined at the end of each game? Both of those options have benefits, both of those options have costs. If you want to determine each player's scenario beforehand, you have to take the time beforehand to determine it. If you want it to be randomly generated, you need to have options for it to be randomly generated that everyone has access to. The scenario topic is a topic that tends to come in as a little bit more of an afterthought, just because you want to make sure that you have your other toppings like your player choice, your narrative arc, or your rules kind of determined beforehand. Like, what? going back to our pizza analogy, you want to make sure that you can buy the pizza that you are going to be buying for your guest. What I mean by that is making and running a narrative campaign takes a lot of time. You want to make sure that the time commitment you are putting in is realistic to the time that you have. Nothing is more disappointing than being in a campaign that starts off extremely strong, but then fizzles out halfway because the GM cannot sustain the effort they are putting into their campaign. Here are some recommendations that I have on where you should spend your time based on the size of the narrative campaign that you're running. Keep in mind, these are my recommendations rather than a hard and fast rule. If a different spread works out better for you, then awesome. Keep doing that. So here you see the breakdown of my suggestions for where you should spend your time when you are writing your narrative campaign. If you have one player, so just yourself, I recommend spending a lot of your time in the rules, in the story arc, and in your scenario. Do not spend a lot of time in your player choice. The reason for that is you as the player, if you're playing by yourself, you already know what twists and turns are going to happen. You already know who's going to betray who because you're the creator. It is more fun for you if you spend your time creating some custom rules for yourself, spending time developing your story arc, maybe each game as it ends, then you write the next step, and also looking at the different kind of scenarios that you can play because you're playing by yourself. If you have 2 to 6 players, I recommend not making too many changes to your rules, just because most of your players are already going to know the base set. About half of them aren't going to read the new rules that you created anyways, so just not spending too much time in your rules, so that way you can spend more time in your story arc and in your player choice and in your scenario. I find that it's especially rewarding for story arc if you kind of have your end goal in mind, but you don't tell your players, so that way they can affect that end. And also present options for your players as they come up. Make that player choice large. If you're running a narrative campaign with 7 to 10 players, your main focus is probably going to be having different rules, whether it's changes in points, changes in what they can do, and not spending as much of your time in your story arc. You're giving them your player choice or your scenario. And finally, if you have 10 or more players for those large narrative campaigns, spend a lot of your time in writing the scenarios. Rules, keep them as written. Don't worry too much about adding too many extra rules. Story arc, have a set endpoint. Have it like we're preparing for a siege, or we have this giant battle that's going to be coming at the end. Don't really give your players player choice, because with 10 or more different choices happening, it's going to be hard for you to keep up with it. But where you can spend a lot of the time is you can make a bunch of different scenarios that are unique to each player and to each game. That's what's going to be memorable for your players. One last thing that I want to spend a little bit more time on is player choice. Player choice is usually the most chaotic and least controllable aspect of any campaign. And the worst part is, for your small personal campaigns, it's really hard to simulate that with just one player. That's why I say don't spend a lot of time in player choice if you're just doing a personal campaign. It's really hard realistically to simulate it. You have written the story, you've mapped it out for yourself to play. It's difficult to create flash decision-making points when you know the flashpoint is coming. It is a little easier to invest in player choice with 2 players, but one of you kind of has to be okay with being the NPC. They need to be okay with witnessing how the story unfolds rather than taking direct action in making the story unfold. I find that 3 to 6 players is best for allowing a lot of player choice, because unexpected events can happen, but as the GM, as the game master, I can easily plan around with those events once they happen. With 7 or more players, it can become really unwieldy to allow that amount of freedom of choice. finally, the last thing you want to think about is how are you going to finish your narrative campaign? What will that last battle look like? While this may seem counterintuitive, like why think about the ending before even playing, I find it's really important to consider. When you plan out what you want your last game to look like, it forces you to think about a couple aspects of your narrative campaign. The first is the length of time. It makes you consider how many games you think each player will need to play in order to tell the story. Once you know this, you can estimate how long your narrative campaign will last for. Say you want each player to play 6 games. If you do 1 game a month, then you can let your players know to try and have 1 day set aside for 6 months. Also, you'll need to consider what that final game looks like. I always like to end with a massive free-for-all or a massive coalition of death using the Gathering of Might rules from the General's Handbook 2018. It allows for a massive game, everyone gets to participate, and it's usually the most memorable event of your narrative campaign to occur. In another video, I'll give you my advice and tips on how to make these games run smoothly in a large narrative scenario setting. And once you have been able to do all 3 of those steps, then you are able to eat and enjoy your pizza, or play and enjoy your narrative game. So to summarize, to run a narrative campaign, you'll want to consider the following steps. How big is your pizza? What's on your pizza? And eating of pizza. Of course, there are many ways to go about planning a narrative campaign, but this is the process that I use when I'm planning out mine. It helps me to keep my thoughts organized and run events that are fun for all involved. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe for more narrative campaign focused videos. In my next video, I'll be going over some tips and tricks that I've learned in order to avoid common pitfalls and challenges when running a narrative campaign, especially in a large group setting. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. And remember, keep telling your stories.